They had nothing left. No grain in the barrel, no neighbors close enough to hear a cry for help, and a winter bearing down on Wyoming like something with a grudge. Rowan Mercer stood at the edge of his property in the dying light of an October afternoon and watched his geese, his stupid, ordinary geese, walk calmly into the side of a mountain and disappear. Not scatter, not panic. Walk in. Like they'd done it 1,000 times before and expected him to figure it out on his own. He almost turned back. He almost didn't follow. That decision, that one small moment of stubbornness against his own fear, would change everything. If you've never seen a story about survival, patience, and what a flock of birds can teach two desperate people about the meaning of enough, stay until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The geese were Tessa's idea, same as most things that turned out to matter. She'd bought the small flock the previous spring from a farmer outside Laramie who was selling off everything before heading back east. A man with soft hands and a bitter mouth who told her the territory would take more than it gave. Tessa had smiled at him and counted out her coins and loaded the birds into the back of their wagon without a word. She'd been raised in a household where people who quit got to watch other people live, and she wasn't interested in becoming that kind of cautionary tale. That was 8 months ago. Now it was the middle of October 1881, the sky the color of hammered pewter from breakfast to supper, and the homestead outside Clearwater Hollow in Wyoming Territory was down to a pair of mules, 11 geese, half a root cellar of vegetables she wasn't confident would stretch to March, and a husband who hadn't slept more than 4 hours in a row since August. Rowan Mercer was not a man who complained. That was something Tessa had appreciated about him when they'd married. His particular kind of quiet that came from processing things instead of performing them. But lately that quiet had a different texture. It had weight. It sat at the supper table with them and ate more than either of them did. "You're doing it again," Tessa said one evening, not looking up from the sock she was mending. The lamp on the table threw uneven light. Outside, the wind shoved against the cabin walls with a sound like a man testing a door he wasn't sure he had permission to open. "Doing what?" "Calculating. I can hear it." Rowan turned his coffee cup in his hands. It had been empty for 20 minutes. "We've got maybe 10 weeks of proper food. If the winter runs long, it won't." "Tessa." "It won't," she said again, and the firmness in her voice wasn't denial so much as decision. She bit off the thread and held the sock up to the light. "We've made it through worse." "We haven't, actually." He said it gently. "This is the worst." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and for a moment neither of them spoke. His face was thinner than it had been last spring. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there at their wedding 2 years ago. The territory had put them there, one sleepless night at a time, and she hated it a little, the way the land just took from a person without asking. "Then we figure something out," she said. "We always do." He nodded, but she could tell he wasn't sure he believed it this time. The geese had started disappearing in early October, around the 5th or 6th of the month, though Rowan hadn't noticed the pattern until a week later. He'd assumed at first that they were ranging wider as the grazing dried up. Geese did that, worked outward in expanding circles when the close grass was gone. He'd find them down by the creek sometimes, or near the old fence line where clover still came up if you looked hard enough. But one afternoon he counted them coming back to the yard and came up short. 2 missing. Then the next day, 5. By mid-October, the entire flock was vanishing for 2 to 3 hours every afternoon, between roughly 1 o'clock and the hour before dark, and coming back calm and unhurried, not the way birds moved when they'd been scared or chased. He mentioned it to Tessa on a Tuesday. "You sure you're counting right?" she asked. "I know how to count to 11. She pulled her coat tighter and stepped outside with him. The afternoon had that particular stillness that came just before the first real cold settled in. No wind, just a heavy, waiting quiet. The mountains to the west were already showing white on their upper shoulders, permanent white. The kind that didn't melt until June. They stood in the yard and watched. 3 geese pecked at the frozen ground near the fence. 2 more sat by the water trough. The others were simply not there. "Where do they go?" Tessa asked. "That's what I'm trying to figure out. I tracked them one day last week, got as far as the juniper stand at the base of the North Ridge before I lost them in the brush." She looked north toward the ridge. It was maybe a quarter mile from the cabin, the base of the mountain they'd never had much reason to explore. Rocky ground, dense with old juniper trees, not good for farming or grazing. They'd filed on 160 acres, and most of what was worth anything sat south and east of the cabin. The ridge side was just mountain. "You want to follow them today?" she said. "I do." "Then let's follow them today." He looked at her. "It'll be cold." "Rowan, I know it'll be cold. I live here." They went out just before 1 in the afternoon, Tessa in her heavy wool coat and Rowan in his canvas work jacket over 2 flannel shirts, and they positioned themselves near the water trough where 3 geese were standing and doing the particular thing geese did when they were about to move. That slight collective restlessness, a subtle shifting of weight and direction. Rowan had grown up on a farm in Missouri, and he knew animals well enough to understand that they were never as random as they looked. There was intention in them, patterns worn smooth by repetition. You just had to watch long enough to see it. The geese began moving at 10 minutes past 1. Not all at once. That would have been too obvious. They moved in small groups of 2 and 3, unhurried, heading north toward the tree line without any apparent signal. If Rowan hadn't been watching for it, he might have thought they were just wandering. He touched Tessa's arm and they followed at a distance, staying low where the ground allowed, stepping through the dry grass that crunched underfoot no matter how carefully they tried. "Try not to sound like a horse," Tessa murmured. "I don't sound like a horse." "You sound like a horse on gravel." The geese didn't seem to notice or care. They moved steadily north through the last of the open ground, into the scattered juniper at the base of the ridge. The trees here were old and dense, their trunks twisted into shapes that looked almost intentional, bark peeling in long strips, the smell of them sharp and medicinal in the cold air. Rowan and Tessa pushed through the outer edge of the grove, branches scraping at their coats, and then stopped. The geese were gone. Not into the air. Neither of them had heard the sound of wings, just gone, between one stand of trees and the next, as if the mountain had simply taken them. "They couldn't have gone up," Tessa said, looking at the rock face above. The ridge here was nearly vertical, old gray limestone, no path a goose could climb. Rowan moved forward carefully, stepping over exposed roots, ducking under a low branch, and then stopped again. He was standing before the base of the cliff, and at first it looked like solid rock. Then he shifted his angle slightly and saw it. A crack. It ran vertically from just above knee height to a point about 6 feet up, barely wider than a man's shoulders at its widest, and slightly wider at the bottom where it met the ground. The juniper trees grew so close on either side that if you weren't looking for it, if you were approaching from any other angle, you'd walk right past it. He'd walked past it every time he'd come to this end of the property, which wasn't often. He crouched and pressed his hand into the gap. Warm air moved over his fingers. Not the faint warmth of sun-heated stone. Real warmth, steady and dry, moving from somewhere deep inside. "Tessa." His voice came out quieter than he intended. She crouched beside him and felt it. He watched her face change. "That's not—" "No," he said. "It's not." They looked at each other in the last of the afternoon light filtering through the juniper branches, and for a long moment neither of them said anything useful, because there wasn't anything useful to say. A crack in the side of a mountain with warm air flowing from it, and a flock of geese that had been walking into it every afternoon like it was the most natural thing in the world. "We need a candle," Tessa said finally. "We need more than a candle. We need a candle first." They didn't go in that day. By the time they'd found the crack and confirmed it was real, and not some heat mirage their cold-starved brains had conjured up, the light was already going, and neither of them was reckless enough to squeeze into an unknown passage in the side of a mountain in the dark. They marked the location. Rowan broke a branch and wedged it into the rock face at eye height, white wood showing through the bark. And they walked back to the cabin in silence that had a different quality now than the silence they'd brought with them. It wasn't the silence of calculation. It was the silence of something opening up. Tessa made supper without speaking much, just the sounds of the cast-iron skillet and the fire and the wind outside. Rowan sat at the table and sharpened his knife, which he didn't need to sharpen, and thought. "What do you think is in there?" Tessa asked, setting a plate in front of him. "I don't know." "Guess." He picked up his fork. "Cave, most likely. Wyoming's full of them, especially in limestone country like this. The warm air could mean geothermal. Hot springs, maybe, or just deep enough that the earth keeps it steady. And the geese know about it. The geese definitely know about it." He ate in silence for a moment. They weren't afraid, Tessa. That's the thing that keeps hitting me. Animals go into dangerous places afraid. Horses, dogs, even cattle. You can see it in them. These geese walked in like they were coming home. Tessa sat down across from him and wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. So what do we do? Tomorrow I go in. We go in. He looked at her. Don't, she said before he could start. Don't do the thing where you try to protect me from something interesting. It could be unstable. The passage could close, or there could be, I know what could happen. I'm going with you. She held his gaze. Both of us go in, or neither of us does, and then we spend the rest of the winter wondering. He thought about arguing. He was tired of losing those arguments, though, and more than that, he understood that she was right. If something happened to him in there, she needed to know what she was dealing with. 2 sets of eyes were better than 1, and honestly, he didn't want to see whatever was in there without her. Fine, he said. Fine, she agreed, and went back to her supper. They prepared that evening with the particular care of people who understood that preparation was the thing that stood between a good story and a bad one. Tessa melted tallow and made 3 new candles, thick ones, setting them into the old tin holders they used when the lamp oil ran low. Rowan checked the rope, 40 feet of good hemp, nothing frayed, and coiled it neatly. He packed the satchel, candles, flint, the rope, a short-handled hatchet, 2 apples, and a full water skin. That feels like a lot, Tessa said. Better to carry more than need it than carry less and wish you hadn't. She nodded, practical agreement. She added the wool blanket from the chest at the foot of the bed, rolling it tight and strapping it to the outside of the satchel with a piece of leather cord. Rowan didn't question it. They went to bed early, and neither of them slept particularly well. Rowan lay on his back in the dark and listened to the wind work its way around the cabin and thought about the warm air moving over his hand, that steady, quiet exhalation from deep inside the mountain, like the rock itself was breathing. Tessa lay beside him with her eyes open and thought about the geese, the specific calm of them, the way they'd moved without hurry or hesitation into a crack in the world. She'd grown up being told that fortune came to those who worked hard and waited patiently, which she'd always thought was true enough, but incomplete. Fortune also came to people who followed their geese into mountains when common sense said to stay home. She fell asleep around midnight with that thought sitting comfortably in her chest. Morning came gray and still, the kind of October day in Wyoming where the cold sits flat and even from first light, no drama to it, just a steady, patient wait. They ate breakfast quickly, oatmeal, coffee, 2 biscuits left from the night before, and dressed in layers. Tessa braided her dark hair and pinned it close to her head, practical. Rowan pulled his boots on and laced them twice. They walked north through the frost-stiff grass as the sun came up behind the overcast, throwing pale, directionless light across the frozen yard. The mules watched them from the fence with expressions of deep philosophical indifference. "Morning," Tessa said to them, out of habit. The mules offered nothing in return. The juniper grove felt different in the morning light, or maybe they were just seeing it differently now that they knew what was in it. The trees were the same, old, dense, their roots working into the rock face like patient fingers. The cold had stiffened the branches overnight, and they pushed through with more noise than Rowan would have liked. He found the marked branch easily enough and turned toward the crack in the rock. It looked smaller in the morning somehow, or maybe it was just that they were actually about to go into it, and the body had opinions about things the mind was committed to. "You first," Tessa said. "Thanks. You're broader. If you fit, I fit." He couldn't argue with the logic. He took the satchel off and held it in front of him, then turned sideways and pushed into the gap. It was tight. There was a moment, his chest against cold stone on one side and rough limestone on the other, his face turned up toward the sky he could no longer see, where he was acutely aware that this was an unusual and possibly poor decision. Then the passage widened slightly, and he took a breath that actually filled his lungs and kept moving, 5 feet in, 10. His shoulder scraped the right wall. He stopped, got his bearings, moved forward again. And then the passage opened, not gradually, all at once. One moment he was pressed between walls of rock, and the next he was stepping out into open air and darkness, and the open air was warm, genuinely warm, the kind of warmth that went into the bones instead of just sitting on the skin. He stood still for a moment, breathing it. "Rowan?" Tessa's voice from behind him, muffled by stone. "I'm through. Keep coming." He heard her in the passage, the scrape of boots, a small sharp sound as she caught her coat on something. And then she was beside him, and he struck the flint and lit the first candle. The flame went still. No draft. The air moved here, but gently, from somewhere below them, and it carried warmth without carrying a chill. In the candlelight, they saw it. The chamber was enormous. Rowan had been in caves before, a few limestone holes back in Missouri as a boy, the kind that smelled of bat and old damp. And they had been low, cramped things, hostile to the human body. This was nothing like that. The ceiling rose 12, maybe 15 feet overhead in places, the stone dome of it smooth and pale gold in the candlelight, marked with the slow, patient work of water over ages. The floor was uneven, but navigable, rising in gentle terraces that caught and held the candle's glow. And the eggs. They both saw them at the same moment and stood still. In the natural stone hollows, dozens of them, carved by water into the terraced floor of the cave, each one fitted to its purpose like something deliberate, lay eggs. Hundreds of them. The geese had packed them in layers, the older ones pressed to the sides of each hollow, the newer ones centered, the whole arrangement speaking to a system that had been working far longer than either of them had been alive. The geese themselves were here, most of the flock gathered in the upper terraces where the warmth was strongest, watching the two humans with the incurious calm of animals who have been safe for so long that safety has become their default setting. "They've been doing this for years," Tessa said, and her voice came out hushed without her meaning it to. "Look at the stone. The hollows didn't form around their nests. They found hollows that were already the right shape. They chose this place." Rowan held the candle higher and turned slowly. The warm air moved past him from somewhere deeper in the rock, and the flame leaned but didn't gutter. The smell was clean, mineral, old, not unpleasant. The whole cave breathed like a living thing. He thought about the temperature. If it stayed constant, and the evidence suggested it did, given the eggs that had been stored here through what must have been multiple seasons, then this cave wasn't just warm. It was a natural refrigerator in summer and a natural warming room in winter. The rock maintained the temperature that the mountain held deep in its bones, and that temperature was apparently exactly what a goose needed. "Tessa," he turned to her. "This cave doesn't freeze." She was already understanding it. He could see it happening in her face. The calculation running behind her eyes. The same kind of calculation that had made her buy geese from a man outside Laramie when most people wouldn't have. "The eggs keep," she said. "The eggs keep," he confirmed, "all winter." The silence that followed was the kind that came before large decisions, before the moment when a life shifted direction. Outside, the wind was beginning to pick up. He could feel the faint pressure change in the cave, the mountain registering what was happening on its surface. Winter coming. Somewhere to the east, their root cellar held vegetables that might last to February if they were careful. Here, in the belly of a mountain their geese had known about since God only knew when, was something else entirely. Tessa walked slowly along the nearest terrace, the candle she'd taken from the satchel casting her shadow large and moving across the cave wall. She bent and examined an egg carefully without touching it, then another. She picked up a third, gently, two-handed, and held it to the candle. The shell was thick, the color of old cream. "These ones here are abandoned," she said. "See how they're pushed to the outer edge? The birds sorted them already." Rowan looked. She was right. In each hollow there was a clear arrangement. The active eggs toward the center, the abandoned or infertile ones displaced to the margins, left there the way birds left things they were done with. "We don't touch the active ones," he said. It wasn't a question. "We don't touch the active ones," she agreed. "Not yet. Not until we understand how many there are, how often new clutches come, what the pattern is." She set the egg back carefully, exactly as she'd found it. "We're going to need to come back. Every day for a week at least. Just to watch." Rowan nodded. He was looking at the ceiling, tracing the watermarks in the stone, the ancient pathways of rain and time. "We need to widen the entrance," he said. "Not much, just enough to get a sled through. That'll take a week of its own." "I know." "We'll need to be careful not to destabilize the face." "I know." She turned to look at him directly. "Rowan, this could be nothing. The eggs might not stay good, the passage might not be stable enough for weight bearing. It could be nothing," he agreed, but it doesn't feel like nothing. She looked around the cave, the geese watching them from the upper terraces, the candle flames burning steady in the dead still air, the countless eggs resting in their stone hollows, and she thought about the farmer outside Laramie with his soft hands and his bitter mouth, heading east because the territory had given him nothing. "No," she said. "It doesn't feel like nothing." They spent 2 hours in the cave that first morning, moving carefully along the terraces with their candles, counting and mapping. Tessa had brought a stub of pencil and the back pages of a seed catalog, and she sketched rough maps as they went. The layout of the chamber, the position of the hollows, the number of active nests. Rowan made notes in the margins. The geese tolerated them with the resigned patience of animals that had decided, for whatever reason, that these two particular humans were acceptable. When they emerged back into the cold, blinking in the flat gray light, Rowan had to stand still for a moment and let his mind settle. The scale of what they'd found was difficult to hold all at once. Not treasure in the gold rush sense, no metal, no mineral wealth. Something quieter and more immediate than that. A natural system, ancient and functional, that could be worked with or ruined depending entirely on how they approached it. "We tell no one," Tessa said, not unkindly, as they walked back toward the cabin. "Not yet." "I wasn't planning to." "I know. I'm saying it anyway because I want us both to be clear." She stepped over a frozen rut in the path. "Once people know about something like this, it gets decided by more than two people. And right now, it needs to be decided by two people who'll treat it right." Rowan understood what she meant. He'd seen what happened when a thing of value became public knowledge before it was properly understood. Claims and arguments, and the particular kind of damage that people did to good things out of a combination of fear and greed. This needed time. It needed to stay quiet. "Just us," he said. "Just us," she confirmed. The cabin came into view through the bare aspens at the edge of the yard, a thin thread of smoke rising from the chimney where they'd banked the fire before leaving. Small, solid, patched in 3 places, surrounded by frozen ground and a sky that promised winter. It looked like exactly what it was, the home of people who were holding on by their fingernails. But something had shifted. Rowan walked toward it differently than he'd walked away from it that morning. Not with optimism exactly, nothing so simple or so fragile as that, but with the specific steadiness of a person who has been handed something real to work with and knows it. The geese were coming back from the cave as they crossed the yard, flowing back through the gap in the junipers in their particular unhurried way, fanning out across the frozen ground without comment, settling back into their afternoon routines as though they'd only been out for a walk. Rowan watched them for a moment. "Smart birds," he said. Tessa stopped beside him and looked at the flock. Her flock. The one she'd bought with careful coins from a bitter man who thought the territory would take more than it gave. "Smartest thing on this property," she said, and went inside to start supper. Rowan stood alone in the yard a moment longer, in the cold and the quiet, with the mountain at his back and the longest winter of his life still ahead of him. Then he followed her in. The days that followed moved with a different rhythm than the days before. Rowan had always been a methodical man, the kind who measured twice, cut once, and was willing to do a job slowly if that was the price of doing it right. Tessa matched him in this, though she came to it differently, through an impatience with failure rather than an instinct for caution. Together, they were careful in a way that neither might have managed alone. Every afternoon between 1 and 3, while the geese made their daily pilgrimage to the cave, Rowan and Tessa followed and worked. The first week was observation only, Tessa's decree, which Rowan respected because she was right. They sat in the cave with their candles and their pencil and their seed catalog, and they watched and mapped and counted. They identified 23 active nesting hollows, each containing between 4 and 9 eggs. They noted which birds nested where, learned the hierarchy of the flock, the large dominant female who had claimed the deepest and warmest hollow at the back of the cave, the 2 younger pairs who nested on the middle terrace, the rest arranged in the descending order of seniority that geese maintained with quiet, unforgiving precision. "The old ones have been coming here longer," Tessa said one afternoon, sketching the dominant female's hollow. "You can tell by the stone. The hollows they use are smoother, worn down more." "Meaning the flock has been using this cave for at least a couple of generations," Rowan said. "At minimum." She added a note in the margin of her map. "Which means the eggs in the abandoned sections," She gestured to the outer edges of each hollow where the discarded eggs lay, have been accumulating for years. Rowan had already been thinking about this. The geese, it appeared, were tidy in a particular way. They kept their active nests clean and centered, but they didn't remove the abandoned eggs. They simply displaced them outward, pushed them to the periphery, and left them there. The cave's constant temperature meant those eggs didn't rot in the ordinary way. They dried and cooled and settled into a kind of arrested state, neither fresh nor spoiled in the manner of eggs left in open air. He'd taken one of the peripheral eggs home 3 days ago and cracked it in the skillet at Tessa's insistence. It had been good, not fresh, a little dense, the yolk darker than new-laid, but good, edible, more than edible. The eggs in the outermost margins, the oldest of the abandoned ones, had been in the cave since before either of them had set foot on this property. The mountain had been keeping them all along, waiting for someone sensible enough to use them without destroying the source. The entrance work started in the second week. Rowan's goal was specific and modest. Widen the existing crack by 6 inches on each side without disturbing the structural integrity of the face above it. He worked with a hand drill and a small iron pry bar, not a hammer. He'd decided against hammering after the first day, when the vibration sent a 1/4-inch crack running along the ceiling of the passage inside, a crack that hadn't been there before and that closed his stomach like a fist. "Stop," Tessa had said, hearing the change in the stone, and he had stopped. After that, they worked with patience so extreme it was almost meditative. Rowan would drill a small hole, wait, look, listen. Feel the stone with his palm. Drill another. Tessa held the candle and watched the ceiling and said nothing except when she needed to say something, which she kept to a minimum because she understood that unnecessary talk was a kind of noise, and noise was something the mountain was not interested in. By the end of the second week, the entrance was wide enough for Rowan to pass through upright without turning sideways. It felt like an improvement wildly disproportionate to the effort, which was the way of patient work. The geese, for their part, continued using the cave without apparent disruption. If they noticed the changes to the entrance, they gave no sign. They moved through it daily, returned daily, nested and tended and arranged and sorted with the same indifferent authority they'd brought to the whole enterprise from the beginning. It was on a Thursday in late October, the 24th. Tessa had written it on the board above the fireplace, her habit of keeping track of days, that they finally had the conversation they'd been building toward without quite naming. They were in the cave in the late afternoon. The light outside had been going gray and cold since midday, and the warm air in the cave had a particular comfort to it after a morning spent mending the fence line in a wind that had gone from unpleasant to hostile over the course of 3 hours. Tessa sat on the lower terrace with her catalog maps spread around her, making final notes. Rowan stood near the entrance, looking back at the chamber. "We know enough now," he said. Tessa looked up. 2 weeks, he said. "We know the layout, the nesting patterns, the rate of egg accumulation in the discard sections. We know the temperature holds. We know the entrance is stable." He paused. "We know what we have." Tessa was quiet for a moment. The candle flame sat perfectly still between them. One of the geese shifted in the upper terrace with a soft sound, the brush of feathers on stone. "So what do we have?" she asked. "We have a natural cold storage that doesn't freeze." He said it the way he said everything, plainly, without decoration. "We have a flock that produces eggs and stores the surplus in conditions that keep them viable for months. We have—" He stopped. Tried again. "Tessa, we have enough to last the winter, not just us." She held his gaze. "Enough for— The Pattersons haven't got enough grain to make January. Mrs. Aldrich is alone since her husband passed in September. The Gutierrez family, the new ones over by Flat Creek, they came late in the season and their stores are— Rowan, I know it sounds exactly like what it is," she said. "It sounds like we found something we didn't expect. And now we have to decide whether we're the kind of people who sit on it or the kind of people who use it for something." She folded her maps carefully and tucked them into the catalog. "I already know which kind of people we are." He looked at her. "We're the kind who follow the geese," she said simply. Outside the mountain, the wind picked up, the sound of it audible even here, the faint moan of Wyoming weather doing what Wyoming weather did, winter making its intentions clear. Rowan nodded, once, the way he nodded when a thing was settled. They blew out the candles and went back through the passage into the cold, the warm air of the cave following them for a few feet, and then giving out, releasing them back to the world they lived in, where the work was not yet finished and the winter was not yet here, and there was still time, just barely, but still, to prepare. The geese streamed out behind them in the early evening, flowing back across the frozen ground toward the cabin, heading home with the same unhurried certainty they brought to everything. Rowan watched them go. He still didn't entirely understand what he'd done to deserve this. The crack in the mountain, the warm air, the eggs laid up in their careful stone hollows like something put there on purpose. He wasn't sure understanding was the point. Sometimes things happened. You followed your geese, or you didn't. You opened your hands, or you kept them closed. And that decision, that one small insistence against your own fear, or your own greed, or your own disbelief, turned out to be the one that mattered. He walked back to the cabin in the failing light, and behind him the mountain kept its warmth and its secrets, and the particular patience of stone that has always known how to wait. The first snow came on October 28th, 4 days after they'd made their decision in the cave. It wasn't the killing snow. Not yet. It was the warning kind, 2 inches overnight that melted off the south-facing slopes by mid-morning, but stayed packed in the shadows and along the north fence line where the sun didn't reach until nearly noon. Rowan stood on the porch with his coffee and watched it, and did the math he'd been doing every morning for weeks. The involuntary arithmetic of a man who understood that winter didn't care about intentions. The root cellar had potatoes, turnips, dried beans, and a crock of salted pork that would last them to February if they were careful, and to January if they weren't. The grain barrel was low enough that he could see the bottom when he tilted it. 2 mules to feed, 11 geese that seemed to feed themselves on whatever geese found under snow, and a wife who ate less than she should and worked more than she ought to, and never once complained about either. He went back inside and refilled his coffee without saying what he was thinking. Tessa was already at the table with the seed catalog maps spread out, adding to them from memory. She'd been refining the cave charts every morning for a week, transferring the rough sketches into something cleaner and more useful, a record they could actually work from. She had a good eye for spatial things. She'd once told him she'd gotten it from her mother, who could look at a bolt of fabric and tell you within 2 inches how much you'd need for a dress without measuring anything. "I want to start harvesting today," she said, not looking up. "I was thinking the same. Just the outer margins. The eggs the birds have already sorted out." "Right." She looked up then. "You were going to say that anyway." "I was." He sat down across from her. "I want to build the sled first, something narrow enough to fit through the passage, flat-bottomed so it slides on the cave floor without catching. We pack the eggs in straw, layer them, keep the load light enough that one of us can pull it through." Tessa tapped her pencil on the edge of the map. "How long to build it?" "Day and a half, maybe 2 if the wood gives me trouble." "The wood will give you trouble." "Probably." He drank his coffee. "I'll start this morning." She nodded and went back to her maps. Outside, the snow ticked against the window glass in a wind that had picked up since dawn, and the mules made a sound in the barn that meant they wanted their hay, and the day organized itself around the work the way days did out here. Not neatly, not with any particular fairness, but with a kind of relentless forward motion that didn't pause for doubt. The sled took 2 days, as predicted, because the wood gave him trouble. The planks he'd been saving since spring were drier than he'd hoped, and 2 of them split when he tried to plane them down to the width he needed. He had to work around the splits, cutting shorter, adjusting the design as he went. Tessa came out to the workshed on the second afternoon and looked at what he had without comment for a long moment. "It's ugly," she said. "It works. Those are not mutually exclusive observations. The cave doesn't care what it looks like." She picked up one end and tested the weight, light, which was the point, and ran her hand along the bottom surface, checking for snags. "It'll do," she said, which from Tessa was the same as high praise, and went back inside. He finished it that evening by lamplight, the shed cold enough that his breath came in clouds, his fingers stiff by the time he drove the last peg. It was ugly. It was the right width, the right weight, and the runners were smooth enough to move without catching on the cave floor. Those were the things that mattered. They made their first real harvest run on the morning of October 31st. The passage was easier now that they'd widened it. Rowan could move through without turning sideways, pulling the sled behind him on a rope, feeling it come through the gap with only one small hang-up near the base where the rock still jutted. He filed a mental note to address that later, and kept moving. Tessa came through behind him, and they lit their candles and stood in the warm air of the chamber and let their eyes adjust. The geese were already there. Most of them settled in their hollows, doing the calm and ancient work of being geese. The dominant female watched them from the back of the cave with the particular expression Geese had that managed to communicate both complete indifference and absolute authority at the same time. "Morning," Tessa said to her. The goose looked away. They moved to the lower terraces first, where the discard margins were deepest, the outer rings of the oldest hollows, eggs that had been pushed to the edge over multiple seasons and left there. Rowan worked slowly, checking each egg before he moved it, turning it in the candlelight to read the color and density of the shell. The good ones went into the straw-lined sled bed, nestled carefully so they couldn't knock together. The ones that were too far gone, he set aside in a cracked clay pot they'd brought for the purpose. Tessa worked the terrace above him in the same methodical way, her movements quiet and deliberate, not disturbing the active hollows, not crowding the birds. She'd developed a sense over the 2 weeks of observation for how close was too close. There was a distance, maybe 4 feet, at which the geese went from tolerant to watchful, and she stayed outside it. They filled the sled in 40 minutes. Not full. Deliberately not full, leaving room for the egg layers to breathe, packing the straw snug but not compressed. When Rowan pulled the sled back toward the entrance, it moved smoothly on the cave floor, the runners doing their job. "How many?" Tessa asked, looking at the load. He counted. 63. She was quiet. "That's one run," he said. "I know." She looked back at the cave, at the dozens of hollows still holding their accumulated surplus, the months and seasons of careful geese work laid up in pale shells and ancient stone. "We could do 2 runs a day, morning and afternoon." "Not every day. We don't want to habituate them to disruption." "Every other day, then." She picked up her end of the sled to help guide it through the passage. "Rowan, if we do this right, if the eggs keep the way the first one did, if we can get them stored in the cabin cold room before the real freeze comes—" "I know," he said. "We'll have more than we can eat." The word more sat between them in the warm cave air, and they both understood what it meant. More than 2 people needed was a different kind of resource than enough for 2 people. It carried a different weight, a different set of obligations. He started backing toward the entrance, pulling the sled. "Every other day," he said. "Starting today." Getting the loaded sled back through the passage was harder than the empty run. The weight shifted, and the hang-up near the base caught one of the runners and nearly tipped the whole thing before Rowan got a hand under it. He held the sled level by main strength while Tessa reached through from the outside and guided the nose of it around the obstruction, the 2 of them working in almost no verbal communication, just occasional short words. Left, hold, now. Because they'd been working alongside each other long enough that the language between them had been compressed into the essential minimum. They came out into the cold morning blinking, the sled between them, 63 eggs packed in straw, and stood for a moment in the juniper grove while their eyes adjusted to the flat October light. "I'll address that snag this afternoon," Rowan said. "After the cold room," Tessa said. The cabin's cold room was a small stone-walled space off the back of the structure that Rowan had built into the north-facing side of the foundation specifically because it would stay cold through winter without freezing solid, cold enough to preserve things, not cold enough to burst them. He'd never had enough to actually fill it. Now he looked at 63 eggs packed in straw and tried to mentally calculate how many more runs it would take to fill the shelves he'd built and never properly used. A lot more runs. Good. They stacked the first batch on the bottom shelf, careful with the straw packing, and stood back to look at them. The eggs were the color of old cream in the dim light of the cold room, dozens of them sitting in their nests of dry grass, and they looked like something that shouldn't have been there, like a piece of luck that had come in through the wrong door and hadn't quite realized it yet. "They'll keep," Tessa said. It was the 3rd time she'd said it. Rowan understood that she was convincing herself, not him, and he didn't interrupt the process. "They'll keep," he agreed. The days that followed settled into a routine that was hard and specific and clarifying in the way that hard, specific work tended to be. Every other morning, before the light was fully up, they made the trip north through the frozen grass and into the cave and harvested from the discard margins, always careful, always measured, always reading the birds and the hollows before touching anything. Tessa kept a running count in the catalog, not just of eggs taken, but of the current state of each hollow, the new eggs laid, the old ones displaced, The slow and constant replenishment that the flock was doing on its own without any help or interference from the two humans who came every other day to take what had already been set aside. Rowan addressed the snag in the passage entrance, and then addressed two other smaller problems he found while he was at it, and by the first week of November, the sled moved through the gap cleanly in both directions without needing to be guided or held. He never hammered. He drilled small holes and used the pry bar with a patience that sometimes surprised even him, and he talked to the rock in the way his father had talked to difficult horses. Not out loud, not with words, but with a quality of attention that communicated something. Tessa found him in the passage on a Wednesday afternoon, stopped with his hand flat against the stone above the entrance, eyes closed, doing that thing. "It's a rock," she said. "It's a complex system under load," he said without opening his eyes. "It's a rock. There's a seam here that I don't like. I want to know if it's moving." She looked. She couldn't see anything. "Is it?" "Not today." He opened his eyes and looked at the seam for another moment, then picked up the pry bar. "I'm going to put a timber brace in, just here, just as a precaution." "When?" "This week." "Okay." She went into the cave. He heard her voice from inside speaking to the dominant female goose, who tolerated it. The brace went in on Friday. It wasn't pretty. A heavy pine timber notched into the rock on either side of the passage, supporting the weight of the ceiling at its narrowest point. Rowan spent more time on the notching than on the timber itself, making sure the stone seats were right, that the pressure was even, that the beam would bear load without transmitting vibration to the rock above. When he was done, he pushed on it in several places, and it didn't move, and the seam above it looked exactly the same as it had before. He felt better about it. Tessa ran her hand along the beam when she came through. "Timber's not local," she said. "I used the spare planks from the woodshed. Those were for the barn roof." "The barn roof can wait until spring." She looked at the beam, then at him. "You could have told me you were using those." "I figured you'd rather have a stable cave entrance than a dry barn." "I would. I just would have liked to have been asked." He held her gaze. "You're right. I should have asked." She nodded, accepting that, and moved through into the cave. Rowan followed, listening for any sound from the brace or the stone above it, and hearing none. By the second week of November, the cold room shelves held 412 eggs, packed in straw and arranged by harvest date, the oldest toward the front where they'd used them first. Tessa had started testing them every few days, cracking one from each batch into a bowl before cooking to check the color and consistency of the yolk, writing the results in the back of the catalog in her tight, precise hand. "Good, good, slightly dense, but fine. Good." Every single one came back good. She told Rowan this on a Saturday evening after supper, reading from the catalog in the lamplight while he mended a crack in his boot sole. "That's 400 eggs," she said, "every one of them viable." He didn't answer immediately. He worked the wax into the leather, pressed the sole back against the upper, held it. "People are going to start running low in December," he said. "Patterson's for sure. I was talking to him at the mill in September, and he was already rationing his grain." "I know. Mrs. Aldrich won't ask for help. She'd starve before she'd knock on a door." "I know that too." Tessa set the catalog down. "So we don't wait for her to knock." "No. We go to her." "Yes." She looked at the fire for a moment, at the way the coals shifted and settled into themselves. Outside, the wind was doing what the November wind did in Wyoming, working steadily, persistently, without drama, but with absolute intent, piling cold against everything that tried to hold against it. "We're going to have to build the sled bigger," she said. Rowan looked up from his boot. "The delivery sled," she said, "the one we use to get around the valley. We'll need more capacity than the current one if we're bringing eggs to 4 or 5 households." He thought about the wood in the shed. He thought about the notched planks. He thought about the barn roof that could wait until spring. "I'll start Monday," he said. "Good." She picked the catalog back up and wrote something in the back of it, and Rowan went back to his boot, and the fire settled, and outside the wind kept coming, and the mountain kept its warmth deep in its bones, patient as stone, holding what it held. The cold room shelves were not yet full. There was still time, and still work to do. And neither of them was under any illusion that the hardest part of this winter was behind them. But 400 eggs in straw, in a stone room, tested good. That was something. That was in fact quite a lot. The delivery sled came together faster than the cave sled had, partly because Rowan had learned from his mistakes on the first one, and partly because he wasn't trying to make it fit through a mountain this time. He used the good planks, the ones without splits, and built the bed wider and longer, with low side rails to keep the load from shifting on uneven ground. The runners he shaped from a dense piece of ash he'd been saving without knowing what for, bending them slightly at the front so the sled would ride up over packed snow instead of digging in. Tessa watched him work on it one afternoon from the barn doorway, her arms crossed against the cold, and after a while she said, "It's better than the other one. Everything I build is better than the last thing I built." Is that a philosophy or a complaint? It's just true. He tested one of the runners with his weight, found it solid, moved to the other side. "I want to line the bed with oilcloth. Keep the straw dry if the weather turns while we're moving." "I was going to suggest that." "I know you were." She went back inside. He finished the sled that evening by lantern light, nailed the oilcloth down with small tacks along the rail edges, and stood back and looked at it in the uncertain yellow light. It was not beautiful. It was the right size, the right weight, and it would carry what they needed it to carry without falling apart. He was satisfied with that. The first real blizzard of the season arrived on November 17th without much warning, which was how Wyoming blizzards operated. A gray morning that looked like every other gray morning, then a shift in the wind around 10 o'clock, then by noon a wall of white moving across the valley from the northwest that reduced visibility to 40 feet and made the distance between the cabin and the barn feel like a different kind of distance than it normally was. Rowan had been watching the sky since breakfast and had moved the mules into the barn before it hit, forked extra hay, checked the water. He came back to the cabin with ice in his beard and snow packed into the collar of his coat and found Tessa standing at the window looking out at the white. "How long?" she asked. 2 days at least. Maybe 3. He shed his coat and shook the snow onto the porch before hanging it. "The temperature's dropping fast. It'll be 10 below by morning." She turned from the window. Her expression wasn't frightened. Tessa didn't do frightened easily. But it had a focused quality, the look she got when she was adding numbers and not liking the sum. "The Pattersons are 6 miles out." "I know." "If this runs 3 days and it gets down to what you're saying," "I know, Tessa. We can't move while it's blowing like this." "No." He pulled a chair close to the fire and sat down heavily, working his boots off. His feet were cold all the way through, the kind of cold that took 20 minutes of sitting still to work out. "We wait until it breaks, and then we move fast." She sat across from him. The fire between them threw uneven light, and the wind outside was a sustained, violent thing, throwing itself against the cabin with the particular fury of weather that didn't understand why structures existed. "How long can they manage?" she asked. "Patterson's resourceful. He's got enough sense to slaughter a pig if he has to." He rubbed his feet through his socks. "Mrs. Aldrich is what worries me. She's been through Wyoming winters before. She's been through them with her husband." He said it plainly, not to be cruel, just because it was the shape of the problem. "This is the first one alone. She's got that small woodpile. I saw it when I rode past in September, and I thought then it wasn't enough, but I didn't want to say anything because she would have told you to mind your business." "Exactly." Tessa looked at the fire for a moment. "We go to her first, when it breaks." "We go to her first," he agreed. The blizzard ran 2.5 days. They spent the time doing what you did during blizzards, tending the animals in short, brutal trips to the barn, keeping the fire fed, working on the indoor jobs that accumulated during busy seasons and got neglected. Tessa darned socks and worked through a pile of mending and reworked the catalog maps with fresh detail, adding notes about the cave in a code only she and Rowan would understand, not names or locations, just symbols and numbers that meant what they meant if you already knew. Rowan sharpened everything that could be sharpened, replaced 3 broken boards on the cold room shelves, and spent an afternoon working on the leather traces for the mules that had been cracking since September. On the second evening, while the wind drove snow hard against the north wall, Tessa looked up from her mending and said, "Are you going to tell me what you're actually worried about?" He didn't look up from the traces. "I'm worried about several things. The specific one, the one you've been sitting with for 2 days." He put the leather down. Outside, the storm pushed and the cabin held, and the fire made the kind of noise fire makes when it's working hard and being appreciated. "What happens when the cave gives out?" he said. Tessa was quiet. "The discard margins won't last forever," he said. "We've taken maybe a third of what's there, maybe less, and the flock keeps adding to it, but there's a rate to that. Spring comes, they lay fresh eggs, but the surplus accumulates slowly. What we're taking this winter is what years of abandonment built up in those hollows, and once it's gone, he stopped. It's not going to be the last winter we need it, Tessa said. No, so we need the flock to grow. He nodded. Or we find a way to encourage more laying through the winter months, which I don't know how to do, or we... He picked up the traces again, ran his thumb along a crack in the leather. I don't know the answer yet. I just know that what we have right now is not permanent, and I don't want to give food to people this winter and then have nothing to give next year. Tessa set her mending in her lap and thought about that for a while. The fire settled. The storm outside, muffled now, pressed and receded. Then we need goslings in spring, she said. More birds. A bigger flock means more eggs, means more surplus in the cave. We could encourage laying in the chamber itself more than they're already doing. The temperature is right for it. They've already established nesting there. If we created more hollows, shaped some from the soft sections of the cave floor, that's a season's work at least. Yes. She picked her mending back up. Good thing we live here. He almost laughed. Not quite. It wasn't really a laughing situation, but the muscles of his face did something in that direction, and Tessa caught it and did something similar, and for a moment the weight of the winter was exactly its actual weight, and not the larger, more crushing weight of everything that winter represented, which was an improvement. The blizzard broke on the morning of November 19th, leaving the valley under 14 inches of fresh snow with a flat blue sky above it that had the particular cold beauty of Wyoming in hard weather. Rowan was outside before full light, hitching the mules to the delivery sled, packing the egg crates with straw, loading the first batch with care. 40 eggs for Mrs. Aldrich, 30 for the Gutierrez family on Flat Creek, 25 for the Pattersons. Tessa came out while he was doing the final loading, her breath smoking in the cold, the old wool scarf wrapped twice around her neck. You pack the Aldrich crate on top, she said. She's closest and most urgent. I agree. I'm just noting it. She climbed up onto the sled seat and pulled the blanket across her lap. You take the reins. My hands are better for keeping the load steady if we hit rough snow. He climbed up beside her. The mules leaned forward into their traces and the sled moved with a low whisper of runners on packed snow, and they went out through the gate and onto what passed for a road in this part of Wyoming. A track in summer, a suggestion in winter, navigable mostly by memory, and the slight differences in the way the snow settled over cleared ground versus open field. The Aldrich place was 3 miles northeast, up a shallow draw that drifted badly in a north wind. They'd get through it, probably. The mules had made worse in worse conditions. Rowan kept them moving at a steady pace that wasn't fast but wasn't cautious either. The middle speed of people who know their animals and know their road and are in a hurry for reasons that don't benefit from rushing. They were halfway to the Aldrich place when Tessa said, "What are we going to tell her?" "What do you mean?" "She's going to ask where the eggs came from. She's not the kind of woman who takes things without knowing the source." He thought about that. The mules blew steam into the cold air and picked their way around a drift that had built across the low part of the draw. "We tell her we had a surplus." "She'll know that doesn't add up. She knows what a homestead our size produces." "Then we tell her we had an unexpected surplus." "Rowan." He looked at her. "She's going to push," Tessa said. "And if she pushes hard enough, what do we say?" He watched the track ahead of them for a moment, the mule's breath rising and falling in the cold. "We say we found a natural cold storage on the North Ridge. A cave. We don't say more than that. And if she wants to see it, then we tell her. When spring comes, we'll show her. When we understand it better ourselves." He paused. "The point isn't to hide it forever. The point is to not hand it over to 20 people's opinions before we know how to protect it." Tessa nodded slowly. Okay. That's a reasonable answer. She might accept it." She looked at the snow-covered draw ahead of them. "Mrs. Aldrich is a reasonable woman." Clara Aldrich was 61 years old and had been in Wyoming territory since she was 32, which meant she had outlasted an extraordinary amount of adversity through a combination of stubbornness and practical intelligence that had never once required anyone's approval. She met them at the door of her small stone house with an expression that managed to be both surprised and unsurprised at the same time. Rowan Mercer. She looked at the sled, then at Tessa, then back at the sled. "Tessa." "Morning, Mrs. Aldrich," Tessa said. "It is morning." She stepped back from the doorway. Come in then, both of you. The inside of the house was cold. Not cold the way a house got during a bad night. Cold the way a house got when the wood supply had been rationed for too long. When the fire was being kept to a minimum because the alternative was running out before March. Rowan registered it immediately and didn't say anything. Neither did Tessa. They sat at her table and she put water on for coffee without asking if they wanted any, because offering coffee was a thing you did, and accepting it was a thing you did, and neither party needed to make it complicated. You drove out here in this, Mrs. Aldrich said, sitting across from them. Her hands were wrapped around a cup she'd kept from breakfast, still chasing its warmth. Roads weren't bad, Rowan said. The roads were terrible, and you know it. She looked at them directly. What did you bring? Eggs, Tessa said. The woman's expression shifted. Not softened. Mrs. Aldrich's face didn't exactly soften, but something moved behind it, something she was working to keep in place. We had a surplus, Tessa continued, more than we can use this winter. We didn't want them to go to waste. A surplus. Mrs. Aldrich said the word the way she might have said unlikely. Your homestead had a surplus of eggs going into December. We did, Rowan said, meeting her eyes. We found a cold storage situation on the North Ridge, a natural one, a cave that keeps a stable temperature. It's been preserving the flock's surplus since before we knew about it. We've just been harvesting what the birds had already set aside. She looked at him for a long moment. The water began to heat on the stove and made a small sound. A cave, she said. Yes, ma'am. On your property. On our property. Another silence. Mrs. Aldrich was not a woman who filled silence with unnecessary noise. She sat with it for a full 10 seconds, which felt longer, and then she said, And you came out here in 14 inches of snow the morning after a 3-day blizzard to bring me eggs from a cave. Yes, ma'am. She looked at Tessa. Was this your idea or his? Both of ours, Tessa said. She got up and poured the hot water and brought 3 cups back to the table. The coffee was thin, not enough grounds, and none of them mentioned it. How many did you bring? 40. The number landed in the quiet of the room, and Mrs. Aldrich set her cup down and looked at it for a moment, and then looked out the small window at the snow-covered yard and the gray sky above it, and something moved across her face that she didn't bother hiding, which meant it was too large to hide. That's a month of eating, she said quietly. More, if you're careful, Tessa said. They keep well in cold storage. Mrs. Aldrich didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, My woodpile. We noticed, Rowan said carefully. I'm managing. I know you are. I don't need... We have 2 cords in the back from the fall cut, Rowan said. I'll bring half of it up next run. Tessa and I don't burn that much. This was not